In this lesson of Real World Vue 3, we're going to look at the essentials of Vue Router. Let's get started. If you're coding along, you can check out the starting code at the L4-start branch. And if we run the project, this is what our app currently looks like. In the last lesson, we touched on how these home and about links are used to navigate between the home and about routes. And Vue Router loads up the about.vue or home.vue component depending on which one we click. And nested within that home component is the event card component we created in the last lesson, giving us all this code we're seeing here. So really what we're talking about here, which Vue Router helps us achieve, is called client-side routing. Now this differs from the older and more traditional kind of routing called server-side routing. So before we dive deeper into client-side routing, let's get a foundational understanding of server-side routing to see how client-side differs from it. With a traditional server-side routed app, a user types in a URL, the browser requests the URL from the server, and the server returns the page. If the user were to click on a link on that page, the browser would request that URL and return the new page, refreshing on every page load. On the other hand, client-side routing looks a bit different. When the user types in the URL, the browser is going to request that URL, and in this case, the server returns that page, specifically index.html, which we'll touch on in just a minute, and it sends along with it the rest of the app. And because the app already has all of the code that it needs within the browser, Vue, with the help of Vue Router, compares and then renders the differences without ever having to reload the page. We can also visualize the differences between these two kinds of routing like so. In a traditional app that is not using client-side routing, the browser is essentially going out and fetching the different content that we need from those different URLs. On the other hand, within a single-page application, like we're building in this course, we're really only looking at one page, the index.html, and as we click around it, we're adjusting which view we're seeing of that app, hence single-page application, just that one index.html page. Remember in lesson 2, we looked at the index.html file. It's in the public directory, and on line 14 is this div with the ID of app. Remember also we looked at main.js, where our app component, which is the root component of our entire application, is being imported, and then we're creating our app and mounting it to that div with the ID of app. So again, our entire application lives at that single page, index.html. Also in this file, we're importing the router, and when we create the app, we're telling our app to use the router. So let's take a look at the router file to understand how it's all configured. Inside the router directory, it has this index.js file, and you'll notice at the bottom, we're exporting router. Just above here, we're creating the router, and notice how we have this history property. When we created our project with the Vue CLI, we selected to use history mode. That's why we're seeing this property here. We're not going to dive into history mode in this lesson, but if you want to learn more about it, check out the lesson resources below. Also here, we're passing in the routes. So let's take a look at these. As you can see, we have a routes array with 2 route objects within it. Although they look a bit differently, which I'll touch on in just a second, notice how they each have a path, which is the URL for this route, along with a name and a property to specify the component to load when we reach this route. As you can see, we're importing the home component from our views directory. Again, the views directory is where we put all those components that we want Vue Router to be able to load up as we navigate between the different pages. In this case, we have the home and about pages, each with their own route. Now that we have a basic understanding of how the router is configured, let's look at how that site navigation is actually triggered. Notice here in the template, there are these router links along with a router view component. These are built-in components provided to us by Vue Router. When a user clicks on this home link, they're actually clicking on this router link here, which has a to attribute specifying the path that we want to navigate to. And when we navigate to that path, because of this route object here, Vue Router knows which component to load up. In this case, we're loading up the home component, but where do we put it? That's where the router view comes in. This functions as a placeholder that is replaced by the route's actual component. If we take another look at the router's index file, we'll notice that create router and create web history are being imported from Vue Router. And opening up the package.json, there it is within our dependencies. Because we selected Vue Router when we created the project with the Vue CLI, that's why we're seeing it here added to the dependencies. This tells our project to use the latest version of Vue Router compatible with this version number, in my case 4.0.0-0. Your version number may be a bit different depending on when you take this course. Now that we're starting to get a grasp of how to use Vue Router, we're going to make some customizations to our app's routes. Our to-do list for this section includes renaming home.vue to eventlist.vue. We'll then customize the route for eventlist. Then we'll update the about file and reconfigure the about route. Because our home file is really a list of our events, let's rename this event list. And we'll rename the file too. Because this file now has a new name, we'll need to import it like so. Now, to configure that route object, we'll leave the path the same, update the name to event list, and specify that when we hit this route, we want to load up the event list component. Next up, we're going to customize our about.vue file. We'll change the text inside the H1 to match our app, a site for events to better the world. Now we can reconfigure the about route. Obviously, this route is configured a bit differently, so what's going on here? As the comment tells us, this is for route level code splitting. In other words, this is a performance optimization. Earlier, when I was talking about client-side routing, I mentioned how we're sent the initial page, index.html, including the rest of the app. Some of you may have noticed that there's an asterisk here, because there are situations like this where we're doing route level code splitting, lazy loading components, so we're not actually sending over the entire application code on the first load of the app. If your app is quite large, it might actually not make much sense from a performance standpoint to send your user all of your application code, every page, every view, even though they might not need it or might not need it yet. Having said all that, our example app is very small. We only have 2 routes and we'll add a third later on. So we don't have to implement any of this performance optimization. So let's delete out this component and exchange this method for the name of the component that we're loading. Now we have a linting error telling us about is not defined because we need to import it. So we'll import about from the views directory. And now our app's routes are configured. We just have one little step left. If we head into app.vue, we'll just change the inner HTML here to events to better match what we're displaying in this view. Checking this all out in the browser, our routing is working exactly like we wanted it to. Awesome. This lesson just scratches the surface of what you can do with Vue Router. We will be touching on Vue Router a bit more throughout this course, but if you want to dive deeper, you're going to want to check out our Touring Vue Router course, which covers all of these topics and more. Finally, to grab the ending code, check out the L4-N branch.